I also sent her some interests that I did right up her face. I didn't think that she'd really enjoy us for programs.
Good evening. Welcome to our One Book, One Sioux County author event. We are so glad to see so many of you. If you haven't had opportunity, we are going to be drawing for giveaway books at the end of the presentation, and there is a table at the back where you can enter your name if you'd like to win a copy, or have a chance to win a copy of one of those books. My name is Jenny Breams. I serve as the Director of Library Services at Dordt University, and I've been part of One Book, One Sioux County since we hosted our first author visit in 2016. Can we begin by giving a big thank you to Renee Franklin and her team here at NCC for hosting this countywide presentation. A year ago, we revealed our 2022 selection, Midnight Assassin, A Murder in America's Heartland by Patricia Bryan and Tom Wolfe. Tonight, after more than a year of planning, we have the pleasure of hearing them discuss their work in person. The mission statement of One Book, One Sioux County is to build community through shared conversation. You are here because you read this book, or you heard about this book, and the story intrigued you. And you'd like to talk about it with others, to talk and discuss what you've read. Perhaps you want to learn more about a historical Iowa murder case from 1900. Perhaps you attended a book club or one of our other programs. Perhaps you've read Susan Glasgow's short story or seen one of her one-act play. Glasgow was a journalist who based her writings on Margaret Hossett's case. Perhaps you're interested in criminal justice, or the legal system, or the role of women in a rural setting, or issues related to trauma. Whatever your reasons, we are glad that you are here. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce our authors. Patricia Bryan is the Henry P. Brandeis Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Among the courses that she teaches is a seminar on law and literature. That combination of interests is very evident in Midnight Assassin. She has degrees from Carleton College, University of Iowa, and New York University. And she has been a visiting professor at Stanford Law School and the University of Iowa College of Law. In addition to Midnight Assassin, Patricia Bryan has written and spoken extensively about the work of journalist, author, and playwright Susan Glasgow. She has researched several criminal cases from the 19th century and has published scholarly articles about them. Thomas Wolfe was born, raised, and educated in the Midwest. He graduated from Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, served as a VISTA volunteer in New York, and earned an MFA in fiction writing from the Iowa Writers' Workshop. His multiple awards include being a two-time winner of the Doris Betts Fiction Prize. One of his other research interests is baseball in the United States. This work includes conference presentations and multiple essays in the Cooperstown Symposium on Baseball and American Culture. His book, The Called Shot, Babe Ruth, the Chicago Cubs, and the unforgettable Major League Baseball season of 1932, was named the best baseball book of 2020. Patricia Bryan and Tom Wolfe currently live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and we are thankful that they've decided to revisit their Iowa connections and speak with us this evening. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
I'm bringing this phone, not to answer it, but just so I can watch the time. All right. Well, Tom and I are so honored to be here. And first of all, I just want to thank Renee and Jenny and Greta and all of the others who have done so much to welcome us.
Is your mic on?
Oh, put the mic on, thank you. Now? Is that good?
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll go back. Thank you so much to Renee, to Greta, to Jenny. Thank you for that nice introduction. We really have been so excited to be here. Since we heard about it, since we were invited a year ago, it was really, we've been anticipating this for a long time. And it's wonderful to be back in Iowa. Tom and I, as Jenny said, we both have real Iowa roots, having spent a long time in Iowa City. and it's a favorite state of ours. And Tom and I both are big Hawkeye fans. So, all right. I want to talk, first of all, a little bit about my law and literature seminar. And I've been teaching that for a long time. It's a little bit of an odd combination. And I was the first one to teach it at the University of North Carolina. The other courses I teach are tax, corporate tax. So it was, everyone when I say that always says, oh, law and literature seems so interesting. So I take that as a compliment. But it is a little bit of a strange combination. And one of the things that we talk about, as I tell my students, we do read books with lawyers as protagonists. And we think about what is societal view of lawyers, not always the most positive, but we think about how we might change that as lawyers. We think about what the professional ethics that they'll be dealing with. We talk about legal ethics and legal issues and how fiction, mainly read fiction, how fiction helps us to see legal issues from a different perspective. We talk a lot about the legal system and not only evidence collecting and how lawyers argue their cases, but also about the narrowness of the legal system and how often the legal system is structured so that it is put out there to decide the truth. But so often what it does is not to decide the truth, but to listen to stories. Lawyers tell stories on both sides, and what the jury is often asked to do is to decide which of the stories makes most sense in terms of their own experiences and their own often biases and stereotypes, and how can you really get a jury of one's peers. We also talk about how important stories are. Stories are important to lawyers. Stories are important to all of us, partly because stories help us understand other people. It's very hard to understand what people's experiences are, especially when they've lived lives that are so different from our own. And I think that stories, and this is one thing that my students and I talk a lot about, how in order to empathize with other people, reading stories, fiction, is really a wonderful way to do that, to get inside someone else's life and to try to imagine what it would be like to have been that person. Especially when you're in a position to judge that person and you don't want to necessarily assume that the way you would act is exactly the way they would act. So, when I started to teach law and literature, I really had no idea how I was going to select the books. So I found an article that listed the top 10 books that were assigned in law and literature courses. And most of them, in fact 9 of them, were ones I knew. Camus and Kafka and Shakespeare and Dickens were all in there. Not so many contemporary ones, actually. There was only one woman, and that woman was Susan Glaspell, and the work was The Jury of Her Peers. I had never read that, actually. And so I was interested in, first of all, I was just interested in who Susan Glaspell was. I found out, as I researched about Susan Glaspell, this one woman author that was on this list. She was born in 1876. She was a rebel from the beginning. She went to college, Drake University in Iowa. She was born in Davenport and went to Drake. She went to college when there were only 2% of college graduates who were women. So it was a very unusual time for Susan to go to college. She majored in philosophy. She excelled while she was there. She was on the debate team and was a real public speaker and very popular while she was there. She moved to New York. She became quite a progressive thinker. She was interested always in the rights of women and children. She was very successful as a writer. She wrote in 3 different genres, which was unusual. She wrote a play which, several plays, one of them eventually won the Pulitzer Prize. She wrote novels, and she wrote many, many short stories, which were published really in the best magazines. Interestingly, surprisingly, and unfortunately, she fell out of the canon when she died. And that was the case for so many women authors. When you think of Willa Cather and Edna Ferber, Kate Chopin, they all sort of disappeared. They weren't taught so much in literature. All of Susan Glaspell's works fell out of print. Glaspell was rediscovered in the 1970s, really by feminist scholars. And the work that became a real classic, that became very popular among first feminist scholars and then much more widely, was Trifles, which was the one-act play that she wrote in 1916. And then a year later, she adapted it to a short story, A Jury of Her Peers. That work, since then, has, as I say, become a real classic. It was selected as one of the 100 best short stories by John Updike in a volume that he published some years ago. It was also selected by Tony Hillerman as one of the best mystery stories of the century. So it really has become one of the most anthologized stories, not only by a woman writer, but by all writers, really. She's become quite well known. And I don't know if you've read A Jury for Peers, but it's a wonderful story. And I know that in not too long, the theater department at Dordt is going to be producing Trifles. So I really recommend that you see it. It's a wonderful and very emotional play. Just to say a little bit about Trifles, because it's interesting to think about how Susan Glaspell came to write Trifles. I think Jenny said this based on her experience in watching Margaret Hossack being tried for her life some years earlier. Jury for Peers is a story about a woman who was accused of murder. Men have thought her husband was strangled while he lay in bed. The story takes place when men, who are the authorities, go to the farmhouse to investigate this murder. Their wives go along with them. The accused woman is in jail at the time. The men follow a fixed line of trying to find out, of investigation, trying to find out what happened that night. They're sure that the women, their wives, who are in the kitchen, which is where Minnie Wright, the accused woman, spent most of her time, they're sure that the women won't be able to find anything, won't know a clue if they come upon it. They're immersed in the trifles of the kitchen. And yet, it's the women who find the evidence. They uncover evidence that shows them that Minnie Wright had been abused by her husband. They recognize her loneliness, her isolation. They recognize her husband's cruelty to her, how he destroyed her vitality and her spirit. And they eventually uncover the evidence that shows that she killed her husband as a final act of revenge after a final act of terrible cruelty by him to her. Now, the women in that story decide, without saying very much, but they bond together and hide the evidence. They really subvert the process by taking it away from the men who are going to try her. They know that the men are going to use the evidence of abuse to convict Minnie Wright, to show that she had a motive. They're able to empathize with Minnie Wright, but they realize together that the men will not be able to understand the reality of her life. And so they basically wrest control from the men, decide that they're not competent to decide the fate of Minnie Wright. It ends with the women hiding the evidence, the men still looking for evidence that will tell them a motive. But we know when the story ends that they are not going to be able to locate it, and the women basically have shown that they are the jury of her peers. So I was interested. All right, Susan Glaspell wrote the story, and what she was doing was criticizing the legal system, showing that the men who were in control were not able to decide fairly, or at least that's what a reader is left feeling. So I thought, how did Susan Glaspell know about the legal system? I knew she wasn't a lawyer. She hadn't written before, I found out about the criminal justice system. So I did a little bit more research into Susan Glaspell. I found that she had written a memoir. And in the memoir, she talks about writing the jury for peers. And she says, I always remember when I went downstate to report on a case where a woman had killed her husband. And I never forgot being in that room where the woman was not. The woman was in jail. She didn't give the name of the case, but I found out that she was a reporter for the Des Moines Daily News 17 years before in 1900, and she had reported on a case where a woman had killed her husband. And I thought, well, great, this must be a case where the woman was acquitted, where the justice system worked correctly. Well, I found out no. Susan Glaspell was, in fact, reflecting on a case which she felt, where she felt that justice had not been done. And that was the case of Margaret Hossick. That led me initially, to research, to find out more about Margaret Hossick. Margaret Hossick, and many of you have read the book, was a 57-year-old farm woman who lived in Iowa with her husband of 60 years old. They had been married for 33 years. They had 9 children, 5 of whom were in the house on the night when John Hossick was murdered while he lay in bed. In Susan Glaspell's story, he was strangled. In Margaret Hossick's story, John Hossick was killed with an axe, very violently. He was struck once with the sharp end of the axe and once with the blunt end of the axe. His skull was cut and then crushed. When the investigators came to try to find out what had happened, the suspicions immediately focused on Margaret Hossick. Her story was that she was asleep next to her husband when the murderer, and intruder she said, came in and struck her husband with an axe. That, not surprisingly, was difficult for the sheriff and the coroner and the county attorney to believe. It was a very small bed. They called it then, it wasn't a double bed, it was what they called a 3/4 bed. So they were lying very close together. She was in the inside and close to the door, so the murderer would have had to reach over her with an axe to strike her husband. That seemed hard to believe. Suspicion also focused on her when the axe was found, the family axe was found underneath the granary with what looked like blood and hairs on it. Why would an intruder have used the family axe to kill John Hossick? Nothing was taken from the house. There was no evidence of an intruder. What really convinced the county attorney, however, that Margaret Hossick was the suspect were the neighbors who came to the inquest and talked about Margaret Hossick having been abused by her husband. They hadn't interfered. They had done nothing to stop the abuse, but Margaret Hossick had come to their houses to tell them that they were afraid. She was afraid. She was afraid that her husband would hurt her, would hurt her children. She had talked to the women in the neighborhood, but the women were powerless. There was nothing that they could do. And the men knew John Hossack. They respected him. He was a leader of the community. There wasn't anything, they didn't think they could do anything either. And of course, at that time, people weren't interfering with how other men treated their families. It was seen as a very private sphere. What you did with your family in the constructs of your home was really no trouble for anyone else. It was not, there was no interference that should have been done. And in fact, when Margaret Hossack and her children complained to the neighbors, at one point when the animosity among the family became very strong, Margaret had run away, the neighbors brought Margaret back and they gathered the family together and they said, we don't want to hear anything more about your troubles. Keep them to yourself. It was a year later, a year after that, that John Hossack was murdered while he lay in bed. And we never knew, no one in the community knew whether they had reconciled or whether, as seemed more likely, the troubles had gone on. But Margaret Hossack and her family were, of course, much more loath to talk about it to the neighbors, knowing that nothing would be done. Margaret was tried, and the first jury convicted her. It was initially, there were 5 men on the jury who voted for her innocence, for her acquittal, and the rest, 7, voted that she should be found guilty. They deliberated over the night. Eventually, she was convicted. It's interesting because, and again, not surprising for the times, all of the authorities were men. The sheriff, the county attorney, the lawyer, the defense attorney, the judge, all of the jury on the inquest, all of the jury in the grand jury, all of them were men. Men were most of the witnesses who testified. Women were observers. They crowded the courtroom, but they really had no voice. What was clear to me after I learned more about the Hossack case was that what Susan Glaspel was thinking about was how justice had not been done for Margaret Hossack. And maybe it wasn't that Margaret Hossack had not done it. I don't think Susan Glaspel was necessarily deciding that Margaret Hossack was innocent. I think what she was saying to us, and still a relevant message today, is that empathy, that empathizing with a defendant is an important part of being able to do justice. That unless the people who are in charge, be they the judge or the jury or the lawyers, unless you try to understand the reality of the life of the person whose fate you are deciding, you're really deciding on the basis of your own experiences, your own stereotypes, and your own biases, which are not necessarily fair for the other person. And I think that's what Glaspel was trying to tell us, that empathy. We can't always share the context of the other person, but trying to put ourselves in the place of the other person is an essential part of trying to do justice. I'll say quickly, before I turn it over to Tom, that we decided to find out more about the Hossack case. Of course, it was Susan Glaspel which brought us to the Hossack case, but as we researched it, there were 3 things that we focused on. One, of course, was what happened to the Hossacks. You know, there was a conviction. After she was convicted, she was sentenced to life in prison. The jury, the prosecutor wanted her to be sentenced to death. At least the jury had enough sympathy or mercy to sentence her to life in prison. She spent 2 years there. She was retried. There was a change in sentiment among the community. As those of you who are taking criminal justice know, there was a lot of problem with the way the evidence was presented. The Court of Appeals and then the Supreme Court in Iowa eventually reversed the conviction, sent it back for a second trial. At that trial, there was a hung jury, so she was released, went back to live in Indianola. We wanted to find out as much as we could about the Hossicks. The internet is really a rabbit hole that you can spend a lot of time, you know, and fascinating stories that you just go deeper and deeper. As I said earlier, we could have written volumes about the Hossick stories, about the Hossick family and everyone who was related to them. So we did a lot of research both on the internet, we went to historical societies, I read hundreds of newspaper articles. I wrote a law review article initially about the Hossicks, telling everything I knew about the Hossick family, again, after going all of these places and talking to people. That was the first thing. We wanted to tell the Hossick story in as much detail as we could. Second, we really wanted to find out more about how the law treated women. And I talked to Greta a lot about this earlier, some about this. I would like to talk to her more because she's done a lot of work on Alice Blood, another woman who murdered her husband, but said she was guilty. She admitted that she had murdered her husband. Margaret Hossick always claimed she was innocent, which was part of the reason the lawyer could never claim justifiable homicide. He could never claim there were mitigating circumstances because she always claimed she was innocent. And I think that really made a difference. The community thought, well, she's lying. And that turned them against her in a way. So we wanted to find out more about how women were treated. Read a lot about Lizzie Borden. She was acquitted. She was a feminine person who cried and wore lace. Margaret Hossick, not so much. She didn't cry. She showed little remorse for the death of her husband. She didn't, as I say, she didn't show tears in court. People didn't think she was acting like a woman. The abuse was held against her. She hadn't made a happy home for her husband, it was said. So we wanted to find out more about the legal system. And finally, we wanted to find out more about the time and place. We did a lot of research on how farm women in Iowa live, the enormous burden of their work. You know, the men were in the fields, the women were in the gardens and in their houses, trying to keep the houses clean, dealing with pregnancies. Margaret Hossick had 10 pregnancies. Her last child was born when she was 44 years old. At the time, all of these pregnancies, she was doing laundry, making soap, dealing with the chickens, dealing with the younger children, mending the clothes, cleaning the house. I mean, there was just so much work that these women did, and yet very little rewards, very little socialization. The men went to town and talked among themselves. They had clubs and business that they interacted with each other. The women, hard to travel, hard to see other women, hard to talk to people. And of course, the winters, as you know, in Iowa, were terrible, harsh for the women. The little heat they had, keeping the fires, cooking. We wanted to be able to tell and get into the life that Margaret lived. And again, not only her family, how she would be treated by the legal system, and then also, as I say, how was it for Margaret Hossick and all of the other women to live in this climate, doing what they did, isolated away from their families, so we could give a sense of what, not only, I mean, well, Tom will talk about this, did we decide that Margaret Hossick did it, right? That's the question. But we wanted to know how she lived so that we could decide partly what would have driven her to this. I will turn it over to Tom, who can answer the question, did we think Margaret Hossick did it? No, I know that's not what you're going to completely answer. I want to know.
Thank you. Patricia is a very hard act to follow. I will do my best. It's great for us to be here. We love being back in Iowa. In addition to living in Iowa for a number of years while we were in school, I lived in Galesburg, Illinois, kind of across the river for almost 10 years, and we sneaked back over to Iowa City on weekends, especially in the fall when I could watch the Hawkeyes play. We both have very fond feelings about being here in Iowa. And we spent a lot of time in Iowa actually doing the research that became the book Midnight Assassin. So I'm going to address three general topics here. First of all, one of the topics is going to be when we decided to write a book about this case, what was the additional research that we did, and we needed this research, we felt, in order to tell the story, and as Patricia sort of alluded to, we also needed to do this research so that we could solve the case. And we figured, 100 years had passed, but we had all this material that we had gathered. Patricia had written about the case for the Stanford Law Review. We were pretty confident that we were good enough researchers and writers that we could write a convincing true crime book where we had a crime, we had an investigation, we had trials in which the woman who claimed to be innocent was convicted, but that we could go beyond that and actually solve the case. I'm going to talk a little bit about what decisions we made to write the book and also some of the research we did. And then secondarily, I'll get to the key question which Patricia has alluded to, which is what did the evidence show and who do we think, or who does a reader think, killed John Hossick? And as Patricia said, it was a particularly brutal murder, hit in the head twice with an axe in the middle of the night while he was sleeping. The first blow from the axe went 4.5 inches into his brain. He lived for 9 hours. Margaret Hossick sat beside him for those 9 hours, holding his hand, giving him water. Neighbors came. All of this was very dramatic, and many of these pieces of evidence really have to do with how the family reacted to this attack on John Hossick. And as Patricia said, there were 5 children, 5 of the Hossick 9 children were in the house the night of the crime. 2 slept in the bedroom right next to where the murder took place. 3 slept upstairs. And I'll get into more of that when we talk about the evidence. And thirdly, the third topic I have is when we got done with the research and actually got done with the writing, how did we feel about what the story was that we had told? Had we solved the case? Had we presented a narrative that was effective and compelling for readers? And readers, of course, judge that. Okay, so our first task here as we decided to write the book was, how are we going to write it? What decisions are we going to make as writers before we actually put pen to paper? One of the things we wanted to follow was the Hossick family. The book starts with a prologue, 1867, October. John Hossick, who's been a farmhand in Illinois, comes to Warren County to buy land. He had saved enough money as a farmhand to be able to start a farm by himself. So the book starts with a scene in which John Hossick is standing on the land that becomes his farm. He kneels down, he feels the dirt. His hands are actually in the dirt. 250 pages or so later, the book ends with a scene also involving dirt, but it's at the gravesite where John Hossick is buried, next to Margaret, who was accused of killing him. So we wanted to have that continuum as the narrative. We also wanted to stay true to the facts. We knew that it would be very tempting as we did research and as we tried to write a compelling narrative to embellish here and there, to write scenes that we imagined happened. But we decided not to do that. Everything, and that's largely due to Patricia's influence, I might say. I'm trained as a creative writer, so I wanted to write creatively. Patricia's trained as a lawyer and has been trained to follow the facts. And so we kind of went with Patricia's direction. Everything in the book is factual, has some factual basis coming from testimony, from a newspaper article, from an interview we did. There's nothing invented in the book. So we wanted the narrative to move forward, and we didn't want to spend too much time going into the past, although we did provide some backstory on some of the major characters. Margaret Hossick, of course, her lawyer, William Berry, the prosecuting attorney, George Clammer, Susan Glasspool, who's a very important part of the story, actually, since she reported on it. And so we do have some of that. Then we decided also that although Patricia had done quite a bit of research to write the article for the Stanford Law Review, which focused on the way stories are told in the courtroom, how competing stories compete for justice, basically. But we wanted to do a little additional research, and I want to go through some of the research we did. One of the first things we did was to contact the Indianola newspaper, the main newspaper in Indianola, Iowa, and put an ad in, quarter-page ad, with the headline, "Who Killed John Hossick?" We wanted to see what kind of reaction we would get from the community. The murder had happened 100 years earlier, but we had a toll-free number, we began to get phone calls. The very first phone call came from a young man who said, "I saw your ad about who killed John Hossick, and I just want to ask you, how can I get a book published because I'm writing one?" So he was not much help. We later got in contact with a woman who had seen the ad, a woman named Rosa Baughman, who was in her 90s, and this is in the year probably 1995 or 96. She remembers that as a child, her father told her about the Hossick murder, and that she was a neighbor, and her father had gone to the farmhouse the night of the crime. So we began to get a few stories like that. One person wrote or called us and said, "Why are you investigating this case? Are you trying to point the finger at somebody?" And suggested that it was better that we not do any more research or investigate the case anymore. Another person who called us said, "It is time for the truth to come out." So we understood from these various kind of anecdotal conversations we had that there were a variety of stories in the community. And we then began to think, it's a bit of a rabbit hole to try to find every story that's in the community, but we needed to follow the threads of some of these stories and see what we could find that would help us understand what had happened. So we contacted a lawyer in Indianola. We were given his name as someone who had been a lawyer for a long time. His father had also been a lawyer in Indianola, so his family reached back to the 1900s. And this is an individual named Stephen Hall, who we named in the book, and he gave us 3 interviews, all on the record. So I don't feel like I'm breaking any confidences to talk about him. And he was very clear that he thought Margaret had not done it. But he was very hesitant to tell us who he thought had done it. And he claimed that he had information from his father, who was a lawyer, and he couldn't divulge it because of attorney-client privilege. Now, Stephen Hall wasn't a client of his father, but his father had a client who had told him a story about 2 brothers who had a dispute over a fence line and that it erupted into an argument, and 2 of the brothers in another context had committed a murder that they were later acquitted for. Very murky. So we had all that to kind of to decide and work with as material. A couple of other things that we were able to find in terms of the research. We found John and Margaret Hossick's marriage license in Illinois, which gave us some inkling and some indication as to what the troubles were in their marriage from the beginning. The marriage license and the birth of her first child are about 5 months apart. So we were pretty certain that one of the reasons that John Hosick and Margaret Murchison married in Illinois was because they were pregnant with child, and probably the Murchison family made some help in getting them to Iowa. And then they later fabricated what the date of their marriage was so they would be consistent with the birth of their first child. We tried to track down Hosick relatives. There was one living granddaughter, and we were able to have an interview with her. She lived in Minneapolis. She's the only individual of that generation that we were able to talk to and interview. And her father was Ivan Hosick, the youngest of the Hosick boys, who was in the bedroom next to where the murder occurred. We asked her about the murder. When did she learn about it? She was never told as a child that her grandmother had supposedly killed grandfather. She heard it from a cousin in Iowa. And then she went to her mother and asked her mother, what's this story? What's this family story about my grandfather being murdered? How come I've never heard of this? And her mother told her, don't ask your father. It's something he doesn't want to talk about. She did ask her father once, though, how did my grandfather die? And the grandfather's, this is Ivan Hosick, is her grandfather. Ivan said, he died of meanness. Or whatever that means. One more piece of research here before I get to the who killed John Hosick part. And that is that the defense attorney for Margaret Hosick in this case was William Berry. His son, Don Berry, was about the same age as Susan Glaspell and reported on the case for the Indianola papers. Many years later, as a journalist, he wrote a history of Warren County, and in that history he describes very briefly the Hosick murder and has a footnote to it which says that he believes Margaret did not commit the murder, but he doesn't give any evidence. We later found that he had given an audio interview that was recorded on a CD that we were able to find and listen to. And in that audio, he talks about how he was on a train coming back from somewhere and going to Indianola, where a woman came to him on the train and said, I know the warden at Anamosa where Margaret Hosick is, and he believes Margaret is innocent, and you and your father need to do something to get her out of jail. So, let me just jump ahead now to what we know about John Hosick and the murder and what the evidence is, and then we'll talk maybe more in terms of the discussion about who killed John Hosick, because I know a number of you have read the book and have your opinions. What?
They voted
Well,
among themselves with their phones.
oh, okay. So we have like 100 different opinions. That's just like doing the research. We found about 100 different versions of the story. Okay, things we know about John Hosick, and I'll finish up here in about 5 minutes. We know this about John Hosick. He was rich, he had a bad temper, he was involved in politics and business, and that means he probably had more than one enemy outside the family. I think that's a consideration. The 2 days prior to the murder was a Thanksgiving. There were neighbors who came to the Thanksgiving. There was no indication of any kind of trouble or tension in the families. On Saturday, the day that John Hosick was killed, he went to the coal bank with his son Ivan. Again, all the family members report that there was no tension at that time in the family. We have a dog that was supposedly drugged. The dog was very listless and lying in the stoop, didn't get up and bark at people in the middle of the night when neighbors came to the house. The prosecution said the dog felt the shame of John Hosick's murder that the family didn't. The dog becomes a key fact. In fact, one of the newspaper headlines at the time was, "Defense rests its hope on dog." There was a neighbor who refused to come to the Hosick house when asked to come, and when he was interviewed by Mrs. Hosick's attorney, he rode off on his horse and went kind of crazy. He was sent to the insane asylum. 3 more things. The axe was considered to be the murder weapon, but it's unclear exactly who put the axe and where it was put. And the hairs that were on the axe were never determined to be human hairs. They might have been turkey come from a turkey or come from a hog, and we know that a turkey was butchered right before Thanksgiving dinner. Margaret Hossack was wearing a chemise at the time of the murder. There was blood on the back of the chemise and on her shoulder, on one sleeve. She claimed to be sleeping back to her husband. But when she was examined by the prosecutor just a few hours after the murder, there was no blood on the front of her chemise. And lastly, I'll just mention something that's always been, problematic for me. During the coroner's inquest, and you'll find this if you have the book on page 46, the coroner, the prosecutor, asked two women who were neighbors of the Hossacks, "What do you know about the question we have not asked you?" Now that's a very indirect question. But neither of them responded in any way that made a whole lot of sense, but it connected to something that Margaret Hossack was asked later by the coroner's inquest, which was, were you ever jealous of your husband? And there seemed to be some sense in the community, some rumor in the community, that perhaps John Hossack, the 60-year-old farmer, was having some kind of improper relations with a woman in the community, which would suggest another possibility in terms of a suspect that was not investigated. So I think I've run out of time, so I think I will stop there. Patricia and I are happy to answer questions about the book, our presentation.
I know you're going to ask, who do we think killed John Hossack? But we'll answer questions first if you. And we really don't have any definitive thing to say, unfortunately. I will say Tom and I don't always agree about this. We are still married, which is a good thing, but we have had some contentious debates about it. I mean, part of the problem is that you can follow these ideas or these theories through in your imagination and sort of come up with how it might have happened this way, but you won't ever know. I mean, the victim is dead. Margaret Hossack says she didn't do it. No one else was there. So it's very tantalizing to go in these different directions. And I think what happened was that we found out we couldn't solve it. So we decided, well, why write this book? And we thought, well, we're writing it about how stories are told in a community, how stories go through families, what the family relationships were, about domestic violence to a certain extent, about the legal process. I will say it was frustrating for us not to be able to tell you who killed John Hossack, but that was something we just couldn't do.
If you want to vote yet, be showing your results.
Oh, I can't wait.
I'll leave that up for a little bit longer.
Yes.
5 in the house, what were their ages and where were they at?
The two boys who slept downstairs next to where the crime occurred were 13 and 16, both boys. Upstairs, there was an 18-year-old boy, a 20-year-old woman, and a 26-year-old woman.
How old was Ivan at the time?
13. He had just turned 13.
Where was Ivan at the house at the time?
At the time of the murder, he was asleep in the room next to where the murder occurred. And everybody, I might note, everybody who testified from the family testified that when the older children came down the stairs, they had to wake Ivan and his brother Jimmy, that they had slept through whatever had happened at that point.
Yeah, Margaret Hossack called her children, and of course it was never proved how long she waited before she called them. There was some suspicion, or at least the prosecution claimed she had waited after cleaning the axe, but she called to her children. She said she had heard the noise of two boards being hit together. Her children didn't believe her, but they did come down. And as Tom said, the two younger children who were right next door slept through it until the older children woke them.
And who was the ones upstairs in charge?
The three children who slept upstairs, one was Will, who was the 18-year-old, May, who was a 20-year-old woman, and Cassie, who was a 26-year-old woman.
In case anybody doesn't know what to do with that, if you have a smartphone, if you go to your camera and you just like hold it up, that you can go, it'll bring you to the page. Just in case.
We have a question right there.
I was born and raised in southern Iowa, so I know where Medora is.
Mm-hmm.
Is the house, there's a county pavement now that goes from Medora to New Virginia. Was the farm along that county pavement, or was it tucked down in one of the gravel roads, or?
I believe it's just north of that road. If I'm remembering the road correctly, it's north of that road, and it's actually the farmhouse sat on a little hill. It was a beautiful spot, but it's a gravel road that runs past it. I haven't been to the house site in several years, but I think it's a gravel road going north from that paved road is where the Hossick farm is.
Was the house still standing?
We don't know. The house was built in 1892, but it was not still standing when we started our research. The granary had just recently been torn down.
That's where the axe was.
Where the axe was found, was under the granary. So we were able to visit that home site, but there's a family that lives there that has built a different house on that. The house where the neighbor Haynes lived is falling down, but actually some of it is still physically there, so I was able to go there. That's kind of down the hill from the Hossicks. So we went to all the places that we knew of, where the Hossicks had been and where Margaret had lived. So. Yes?
I felt that the police did a very bad job of investigating the whole murder, but
Agreed.
was there any looking at the fact that someone could have entered the bedroom window and plugged into that?
Well, I completely agree with you that the sheriff and the county attorney who was there directing the investigation and who had very quickly decided that Margaret Hossick was the main suspect. There was little attention given to that. And part of it was that there was no sign of, John Hossick's wallet was still found with, what, $30 in it. There was a Winchester rifle that was this doesn't mean an intruder wouldn't have come, but there was, nothing had been broken into, the window wasn't smashed. But, what was really interesting, I think, was that they didn't do any investigation of what had happened to the other children. I mean, certainly there was animosity with the children. They didn't look into Haynes, who had gone crazy, taken to the insane asylum after the defense attorney had talked to him. The circumstantial evidence, as Tom said, the hairs on the axe were never definitively proven to be human hairs. And as many of you in criminal justice know, there was no chain of custody for those hairs. I mean, they had been kept in the sheriff's wallet, then he had given them to the prosecutor, and who knows whether the prosecutor, the hairs that he gave to the scientist, were really the hairs. I mean, that was why the Iowa Supreme Court eventually overturned it, because the evidence was so poorly handled. The axe, when the person found it, was basically passed around to all the men. And they looked at it and said, that's hairs, or oh, that's blood. And then finally one man said, we shouldn't handle it anymore. And they threw it back under the granary. I mean, it's just interesting. And I think that is really because they focused on Margaret Hossick. And
But it would account for why the blood was on the back side of her body, is what I kept thinking.
well, yeah, yes. And one of the theories that many of you might have come up with is, why did the blood got there, maybe because she was sleeping next to him, or maybe because someone, an accomplice perhaps, came and, axed him to death while she had her back turned. Go ahead with it, I don't want to see it, but there was certainly blood splattered. There was no question it was such a violent, and I think they could see on the wall that there was a place where the person had stood.
Yeah, the blood splatter was in a circular direction all the way around the room, except for one spot, which is where the assailant must have stood. So whoever the assailant was would have been bloodied on the front.
But if you read anything about Lizzie Borden, there are all these theories that she changed clothes, and who knows whether Margaret, it doesn't seem like Margaret Hussey did that. She didn't have that many clothes, but why there wasn't blood on the front is a good question. Yes?
Who found the axe?
It was a neighbor who found the axe. Am I right about that?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, it was a neighbor who found the axe, and that was confusing because Ivan was told to put the axe away, and Ivan said he had put it inside the granary. And everyone, when they found it, it was underneath the granary. And Margaret herself, when questioned, said, "Oh, I think it's underneath the granary," which was why the sheriff said, "Oh, she knows where the axe was, underneath the granary." Now, later, Ivan changed his testimony and said, well, he thought years later, 2 years, he thought he had thrown it under the granary. So when it was found, yes, it had what looked like blood and hairs. It was also true that Will had killed a turkey 2 days before. So hard to know how much that axe really today would have been used as evidence. Yes?
Did they have any employees at the granary that you might have upset?
Employees?
Was it a family granary?
The granary was a building of some kind that was used for, I think, storing grain. But there weren't any hired hands on the Hussey farm.
Yeah, in fact, the two older boys, you would think that they would stay home and help their father, but in fact, they went off to work as hired hands for other families, which sort of suggests that there was some bad feeling, and certainly there was, what neighbors testified and members of the family, that there was bad feeling with the sons toward the father. Which raises the question, why weren't the sons ever suspected? I mean, neighbors suspected them, but they were never investigated by the police, which goes back to the fact that they focused on her because she had a motive. She was abused, and she hadn't done what a wife should do, which is to, what does one quote say? With her pleasant smiles, ease the gloomy clouds over his brow or something. She hadn't done that. So, yes.
In 1900, was getting fingerprints even an option?
I think not. I think
not.
Yeah, that was not something that they could do, and it wouldn't have been useful on the axe anyway, because there were 6 or 8 or 10 people who had handled it, and it was a family axe that was used, for chopping wood and for killing turkeys. So I mean.
But hadn't Will chopped wood the day before the murder?
He had killed a turkey the day before Thanksgiving, which would have been a Wednesday, and the murder was on a Saturday. And then he chopped wood, I believe, after that.
So turkey blood shouldn't have been left on there if he chopped wood.
There was some blood on it, which, I don't know. I don't know that they ever defined where the blood was on the axe, so they would have, might have been more up on the handle, rather than on the blade.
One of the things that I found interesting, just thinking about how the legal system treated women, was how the whole idea of whether she was a good woman or not was raised in court. And one of the arguments that the prosecution raised was why did she, if she heard something happening to her husband, why did she call it to her children? Wouldn't it have been natural for her to turn to her husband first? And if she hadn't, maybe that meant she wasn't a good wife. Or if she was telling the truth, that she had slept through the attack, how do we know she would have woken up if one of her children had been sick? And if she was right in sleeping through the attack, she wasn't really a good mother. And that sort of damned her. You know, either she wasn't a good wife, she wasn't a good mother, therefore she's not telling the truth.
Therefore,
And,
she's guilty.
yeah, right. Therefore, she's guilty. And she didn't cry, you know, as a woman would. So it really became what kind of a woman she was, I think. Oh, that's interesting.
So this is the result. There's
Yes.
actually
Yeah.
an extra someone else. I really think Margaret did it, but I put someone else.
Well, you know,
Make
Greta,
it live.
I often go along with you in thinking Margaret did it, although she's so sincere in saying she was innocent. You know, her last words to the judge are, "Before my God, I am not guilty." I always say maybe she had a psychic break. You know, she did it, and then she believes she didn't do it. You can say,
That's a good theory. There was a,
you disagree with me enough when we talk about it.
there was a question about the dog being chloroformed and whether or not Margaret could be chloroformed also. That is actually a theory we heard from a great-grandchild of Margaret Hossick. We were able to interview the grandchild of Annie Henry, who was the oldest daughter. And that family, that thread of the family from Annie Henry on down said their theory had always been that the dog and Margaret had been drugged. Then the murder had happened, and that accounts for why the dog was listless and why Margaret seemed kind of groggy when she called up the stairs to her children.
And maybe didn't wake up right away.
And maybe didn't wake up right away.
You have a question.
I'm just curious, trying to picture it, how feasible was it for a 57-year-old farm wife to handle an axe, and would that be the most reasonable weapon for her to use?
Very interesting question. And, you know, the way women most often killed, well, not Alice Blood, but the way many women killed was poison. You know, that would seem to be the feminine way to kill. What?
Smother him in his sleep?
Yes, smothering, right.
That would look like a natural death.
Yeah, right, dealing with the bedclothes. But yeah, dealing with the bedclothes and dealing with the food, right?
I don't think she could if he woke up, he would have beat her crazy. Yeah.
Well,
She wouldn't dare do that. She should have got the Winchester.
yeah, she would have had to drug him first and then smother him. But I think that, yeah, one of the prosecution witnesses did testify she was handy with an axe. You know, and that, of course, a farm woman would have been able to chop wood. Whether she would have been able to do it twice to her husband, you know, because she would have had to, with the, I can't really act, but with the sharp end, and then turn it around and crush his skull with the blunt end. I mean, that would have taken a fair amount of force. And I don't know, maybe he woke up in between. It's hard to visualize, isn't it? But
I think one of the key things is if you hit somebody in the head with the sharp edge of the axe and then the blunt edge of the axe and you crush his skull, you want him dead. I mean, you know, whoever committed this crime wasn't interested in robbery or anybody else in the house. It was directed to one person, John Hossick. So the question really in terms of suspects for me is, who hated him enough to kill him? Family member, outsider.
A lot of people in the book, I think, that hated him.
yeah, sure. Yeah. But you know, you have to be pretty accurate if she really was lying next
Yeah.
to him. I mean, the fact that she said she didn't feel it and certainly wasn't heard. Yes.
The picture in the book shows a big blood stain at the foot of the bed. So if that's where the murderer was standing, they wouldn't have had to reach across her. And they first said that it was a left-handed person. Well, a left-handed swing would have swung away from her.
I think it still would have gone over her body.
But if they stood at the foot end of the bed, there's a big blood stain at the foot end of the
Right.
bed.
Although there was a rug on the side where they thought the axe had been laid at one point. I know that blood stain. I mean, it's just hard to imagine because there is that blood stain in front. I always thought one of the interesting things that the prosecutor said was there wasn't blood in the living room as the murderer walked through to the door. And he said, well, the wife would have known to put a towel under it so she wouldn't have to clean up the blood. You know, that was the theory. Yeah, so it must have been her, yes.
Not a son. A son would have just let the blood.
As mothers of sons know.
At night, midnight, it had to be dark.
Mhm.
So in order to hit somebody square on the head, somebody had to hold the lantern.
Isn't that,
Okay, which wasn't mentioned. But the left-handed one, wasn't Will left-handed?
Yes. He was the only one in the household who was left-handed.
So then Johnny was holding the lantern.
or Margaret? I mean, that was,
Yeah.
you know, that was one theory we found in a diary of someone who was related, that it was probably Margaret holding the lantern and one of her sons killing him. And maybe Margaret thought she would get less punishment, you know? Or has anybody ever seen the Murder on the Orient Express?
Yes.
You know, where they all take their turn? I mean, sometimes we thought, maybe that, you know, it's just, so then it would be everyone. You vote for everyone. But that is really interesting. I'm just going to look over here. Oh, Ivan. Yeah, I don't think Ivan did it. That little 13-year-old.
Yeah.
Yes.
Another interesting thing is how things are phrased, because there's a difference between saying, I am innocent, and saying, and I did not kill my husband with an axe. She could very well believe in her heart that it was justifiable, or she was protecting her children whose abuse we haven't really, potential abuse.
Mhm.
Why did those sons leave, like you said? So you could very well make that statement and believe it in your heart and feel like you are not perjuring yourselves. Because the question that wasn't asked is, but did you kill your husband?
That was asked in the second trial. They didn't go into that in the first trial, but in the second trial, I think they said something like, did you have an axe in your hand at any time that night? And she said, no. Did you hit your husband with a lick, I think was the term that they used. And, you know, she said no, but again, I think you're exactly right on innocence versus hitting him, because I think she might have felt it was fully justified, and therefore she was innocent, even though she had done it. I've always been, you know...
Maybe the mom was more for children. I mean, think, what would you do for your children if you're a mother?
Right.
And take the brunt of it yourself.
Wonder why... Yeah,
Yeah, I was just going to say, and vice versa. I mean, the children saw her being abused, so the children might have been very protective of her to the point where they would kill the father. And certainly the children were protective of her when she was on trial. All of her living children came to the trial. They all testified that she was innocent. She was totally supported by her children.
Yeah, and one of the last scenes of the trial, she's holding one of her grandchildren in her lap. You know, and certainly in Lizzie Borden's trial, one of the whole arguments was, how could you believe that a woman would be capable of this kind of crime? You know, look at her. Could she be such a monster? And there's Lizzie crying and dressed in lace and with flowers. You know, could you believe that this woman could do such a thing? Margaret Hossig didn't really present that same kind of picture. And yet I think the defense, by having her hold this grandchild, was making the same, you know, trying to draw the same kind of picture. It all depending on what a woman's innate nature is, which is interesting. Yeah.
I remember reading
trial, more evidence was found that was not used in the trial, like footprints in the orchard and things. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that, or why that was discovered after the fact?
It was discovered after the fact, we believe, because they just didn't do a very thorough investigation before the trial. So, you know, as we've said, the prosecutor, County Attorney Clammer, fixed on Margaret right away. And, you know, to an earlier point also, the sheriff, the deputy sheriff, the coroner were all in their first terms. None of them were experienced at what their jobs were. They had never been involved in investigating a murder, so they were pretty incompetent, I think it's fair to say, in terms of doing this investigation. But then after the murder, there were these footprints that were supposedly leading from the Hossick farm down toward the Haynes farm. Does that prove that Haynes was involved? I don't know. I mean, Haynes was not available for the first trial because he was in the insane asylum. He did testify in the second trial and admitted that he had lied to the Hossick children when they had come to him for help on the night of the murder. He said he had seen an intruder on the porch and he was afraid to go out. Yeah. That intruder, you know, he was mentioned in the first trial as a possible suspect. Who's this strange person knocking on the door of a neighbor to the Hossicks when the Hossick man was killed? But then Haynes, in the second trial, said, well, I lied. So, is Haynes a good witness? If so, for which side? No, he's very unreliable as a witness. Yes?
Do we have any proof that their son, Alex, was John's biological child?
No.
Because John bought the land on October 28th, and daylight then was like the length of days now about, and I thought that it was about 240 miles from his farm back to the other place, which would be a 73-hour walk. So it probably took him a week to get from Iowa back to Illinois. So he'd be in Illinois like the first week of November, and they got married 11/29. I think she was pregnant by somebody else.
That is an interesting theory.
And I think that her dad paid him to take her away, because when he died 2 years later, she got $500 and her 3 siblings got a lot. I think the dad paid her share of the inheritance, paid John to take her away because it wasn't John's baby.
Well, that's a very interesting theory. And one more theory.
Yeah. And then, did it say that John's parents came to visit them?
Came to live with them.
Came to live with them.
In this small house.
Yeah, and then Mrs. Haynes knew that John was in love with Margaret's sister.
11 years older, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think Alex went back to Illinois.
Alex Hossick?
The oldest son went back to Illinois to find out about this and to find his other grandparents.
Although he worked most of his life in Iowa, I mean, he moved around a lot, but I don't know that we have anything in the book that indicates he went back to Illinois.
Well, but I think he's the one that committed the murder. He was just, the 8 children stayed at the house that night.
Yeah.
And then he would be there the next day, so he wasn't too far
I
away.
think Alex had an alibi because he was working on a farm the night of the murder, more than 100 miles away from Warren County.
Oh, okay.
So I don't think Alex could have been directly involved.
Yeah, I want to say one more thing about the legal system, being a lawyer. Just that I think the legal system was in a real state of transition, and I think that many communities did not feel that the legal system could find out who had done it. And there had been a period of lynching right soon before this case was tried, and there were also trials that were held, the guilty person convicted, and then because the evidence was handled so poorly, a court of appeals would overturn the trial, the verdict, and the person the community had decided was guilty would be sent back home. And I think Clamor, the prosecutor, was determined that that would not happen here. And I think that's in part why he fixed on Margaret Hossack. Little did he know that there would be evidence, or at least an argument that would be made against that theory. But he was, and we talked to his, was it his daughter, his granddaughter? Some years later, and as she said, this was one of the great failures that stayed with him, that he was not able to prove. And again, I think he felt terribly guilty for the fact that he had the botched investigation, because he was committed to first criminal trial, very competitive, really wanted to be a success, and this he saw as a failure. He wanted to prove that the legal system could do its work, and yet he did not really succeed.
And he was a very ambitious man. He'd gone to Simpson College. He was a star student. He'd gotten a law degree. He'd become a prosecutor at age 27 or 28. He thought he had a career in politics, most likely. And when this case didn't work out for him, when he lost the second trial, basically, he left Iowa and lived the rest of his life in Fort Collins, Colorado. So, I mean, it really had a devastating, the loss of this one case really had a devastating effect on his career and on his life.
How much time was there between the murder and the trial?
The murder was December 1st and the trial was in April, so I think 4 months.
A few months,
you know, yeah, compared to today. Yeah.
Yeah, and really, as someone brought up at dinner, if you read some of the articles which we have, it's just amazing how subjective they are, and you know how they both, as I said, reflect and reinforce stereotypes about women, and some of them are quite negative about her. But then Susan Glassell changed her impression of her and gradually portrayed her in much more sympathetic terms. As, you know, she must have felt, as we know from writing Jury of Her Peers, she really did see that she was being, I don't know, if not misjudged, that the reality of her experience was not being exposed. And of course, you know, as I have said, that is the reality of the legal system. There's little that we can do about that. You know, the legal system is focused on what happened that night, and we can't always say, why did the person do it, going back to their childhood and everything, you know, that happened to them. Eventually you have to accept, well, there's free will involved. So there are faults with the way we decide on someone's guilt, but how to change that is a real question. I know we are running.
Tom, I got one more question.
Oh, please.
She goes to prison after the initial trial. Who inherited all the money in the land?
Good question. Well, we found the probate records, and actually she did inherit a part. I think I know that there is a law now that a person, do you know that?
Yeah, you can't gain proceeds from a crime.
Right.
As a result of it.
And does that change? Would that change after she was released, a hung jury? I don't know either. But I think at that time, and I don't know if the land was auctioned off how long after?
It was, I think it was in the spring or summer. I mean, it was pretty shortly thereafter that the land was disposed of. And the house was a 6-room house that was very fancy for its time at that point.
Where'd the kids go then?
Also interesting.
Yeah, they went many different directions. Johnny, who was on a farm nearby, went and wound up being a truck driver in California. Will went to Colorado, became a miner, died of syphilis in his 30s. The girls all married. One moved to Utah, several stayed in Iowa. Ivan wound up in South Dakota, in Mitchell, South Dakota, and became a barber.
He went to a foster home.
Went to a foster home.
After, because he was only 13.
Right. And then he served in World War I and then came back and was a barber in South Dakota.
The children really had very sad lives afterwards. Two of them, one of them died of syphilis, and Johnny also, possibly.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, Johnny died in a psychiatric hospital.
Right, and that can be a result of syphilis.
And Jimmy went where?
Jimmy was an alcoholic.
Jimmy worked for the railroad, but was an alcoholic.
He lived with his mother for a time. I mean, May, who married someone in the community, he was an abusive man, and she was terribly abused during her life. I mean, you know, you could say, well, that's the times, but it was also, I think, those children were traumatized. Ivan was the one who came out.
Ivan had the most normal life of the 9 children.
Right.
Well, the happiest life, certainly. I think we have time for 2 questions, is what I was told. Yeah.
I'm just curious, in your research, did you find any connections to the Villisca axe murders and the multiple axe murders that were happening across Iowa and the Midwest during that time, and all of Bill James and his daughter's research?
We didn't find any connection to the Villisca murders with the Hossack murder. But that is a fantastic book, the Bill James book on the Villisca murder, which is a very, I think, eight people killed in one house at one night, and nobody ever convicted, and I don't think they ever even found anybody to charge with the crime.
Yeah, we went to a presentation once. We did a presentation where they were also on the panel, and we talked a lot about, you know, would there be a connection? But as Tom said, that's a fascinating case.
Yeah, I just wondered if that's where this was at the end of a rail line, because that was their hypothesis.
Yeah. Was there another question?
Oh,
yes.
I have one. I wasn't that curious really about who killed Margaret. I'm more curious about you two writing this book. Like, how long did it take from the first time you wrote the first chapter to you finally ended the last chapter? How long did that take? And how did you divide the work up between the two of you? And actually writing the words in, you know, was there a back and forth and stuff like that to decide what to write down?
Well, I'll say first that I worked alone on that Stanford article, and that took me many years. I mean, we did have a child who was 2 and twins who were born during that time. So, and I was working full time. So I took some time off from working on that book, and I published that article in, what did you say, 1997.
Yeah.
And then we started working on it together, doing the research that Tom was talking about. We also took some time off, again, with Tom working on the baseball book and me working on some tax articles. As for how we wrote it, that could be somewhat contentious. You know, again, I'm a lawyer, and I think every fact has to be, you know, cited. I remember Tom wanted to say, oh, the wives and the girls cooked the turkeys and cooked the Thanksgiving dinner and served the men. And I thought, well, probably, you know, but we're not writing a history of what happened, the way women lived. And so we sort of fudged that. I mean, we say that. I let Tom say, you know, the horse's manes blew in the wind, or whatever you wrote.
One of the sentences I got to keep.
But, you know, literary nonfiction, you take certain, I mean, you describe a scene, but So how did we write it? I would say we took certain parts, and I wrote, for instance, the part about the farm women. You wrote certainly the part about the Ivan and John Hostetler coal bank. And we took, you know, the part about them playing beforehand. A lot of it we took from the inquest testimony. You know, so there wasn't a question of making up scenes so much. There were scenes that were described in the inquest testimony and in the trial by the participants, and so we just kind of dramatized them without changing them. What we really wanted was to have it be one voice and not going back and forth, and that happened. I would write something, Tom would edit it, I would change it back. Tom would edit it. I mean, we really, I would say.
Yeah, we passed drafts back and forth, and we did make decisions about, I'll write this part, you know. But everything that either of us wrote, we knew was going to be edited, or at least suggested edits would come from the writing partner. And I think I tended to write more of the descriptive parts. I wrote about William Barry's house and his background. Patricia certainly got the final say on everything that had to do with the courtroom, the coroner's inquest, and anything that related to stories in the courtroom from her article. So it was, you know, when we got down to line editing, you know, where you're editing comma by comma and word by word, we just had to make the best choice possible, and we didn't really have too much. It wasn't very contentious at that point. So, you know, I've often said, you know, writing is not a team sport, and maybe writing together takes a little longer. But I think that in order to merge our voices so that the narrative as a whole sounds like it comes from one voice, required us to spend more time kind of doing that back and forth.
And I will say we had a very good editor from Algonquin. He really helped us a lot in, you know, this doesn't really work here, and there's not a smooth transition. I mean, you don't always get that. We were very lucky to have someone who looked at it closely and we could talk to it. I mean, I think that's rare, but that helped us.
And I will say that as challenging as it was to write this book, we did write another book together, which is called The Plea. If you could take a look at it, it's on the stand as we got here, which is also an Iowa murder case. So,
yeah, we really recommend The Plea to you. It's about an 11-year-old boy who is sent to Anamosa for killing his parents, and it's The Plea, the true story of young Wesley Elkins and his struggle for redemption. He was in prison, a maximum security prison at the age of 11, lived there for 12 years. The wardens, as we would know today, really took him under their wings, and he educated himself and fought eloquently for his parole, found respected men in the community who took his side, and he eventually did earn his parole, but only after a very bitter controversy in the state, which pitted the theory of innate criminality, and, you know, if he were released, he would infect the population, versus the possibility that, especially a child, could be reformed and rehabilitated, was at a young stage of development, and environment really made a difference. And he had been abused as well. So in a bad environment, put in a good environment, did that mean a change, or once you committed a crime, were you always depraved?
All right, so I really hate to stop the conversation because I love the investment in the questions and the conversation regarding the book and all of your research. I have the task of wrap up here, so hopefully I don't forget anything. I am Nicole McCrae. I'm the director at the Rock Valley Public Library and on the One Book, One Sioux County committee. I just want to say thank you to Patricia and Tom for being here and sharing with us all.
I think I can say for all of us that it's been a fun night to listen, but even just share in the conversation and hear what everyone's thoughts are and what you can give us even more than what we've already read. So I appreciate that. Like you said, you guys have some books at the table back there, so feel free to stop back and talk to them some more or take a picture if you want to. I think you guys are okay with that, aren't you? Okay. And also, I had this thought in the back and I wasn't going to say it, so please don't, because I thought you might be offended, but I just was thinking of it at the end here too. If you guys were Colleen Hoover, I think that, Tom, you would probably write a short 90-page novel of your creative and theoretics of what really happened and make millions on that too. So.
And me not so much.
Well, I just mean because that's what she would do, right?
Right.
So anyway, I also wanted to give a little plug. Dort's Theater Club is going to be putting on Trifles by Susan Glaspell, as you mentioned earlier. So that's going to be on November 18th and November 19th. There's flyers back there, so you can feel free to grab one. You can also follow us on Facebook, One Book, One Sioux County. We share the events that we do to help promote the books that we select, as well as I know, Tom, you were definitely following along this year. We shared some of the podcasts that you did, so if you're interested in hearing more, I mean, you can certainly do a Google search and find that, but we have shared that there too. Am I missing anything besides what I need to go on with here? Okay. All right, so we're gonna do, am I doing the drawing or no, I'm doing the reveal first, I guess. Okay, so I get the fun task of revealing next year's book. We are actually going into our 8th year. This will be our 8th book pick. And so the book is Sugarbirds by Cheryl Gray Bostrom. I enjoyed this book a lot. You guys will want to get it on your book list right away. I see some of you in the crowd have read it. Once you get started, you will not be able to put it down. It is just very intricately woven. It is a fiction title, and I have the copy here that I have for you guys so that you can read it too. And I'm not going to give much of a description because we have a video from the author, and she does a much more eloquent description. I think, can I quick do the drawing and then we'll show that? Well, is that okay? All right, so this is, hopefully you guys got your name in. We have books at the red table back there, so if I choose your name, you get to go back there and pick a book. So we have a few copies of Midnight Assassin, the book that we've been discussing tonight, a few books or copies of The Plea, and then wrapped, we have next year's book pick, Sugarbirds. So you can choose which one you would like to take home. Of course, if you choose Midnight Assassin or The Plea, you can have it signed tonight too. So let me stir these up quick a little bit. All right, the first one is Ruth Anderson. All right, so if you want to go back there, you can. You'll get the first pick. And then I'll take one from down there. Adele Vogel. Yay! All right. Oh my gosh, she won last year's too. You are a lucky lady. All right. Judy Klein-Woltering. Okay, you can hold that. Everyone should be here unless somebody dropped out early, which I don't think they did. But. Carolyn Gould. Okay, yes, go ahead and go back. Steve Kelling. All right, you can pick a title back there. Cheryl Hoekstra. Natasha Hoyer. I think that was the last one. So now you are going to get to hear from Cheryl, a short video.
Hi, Sioux County.
Come back
I'm
next year.
Cheryl Gray Boston, the author of the novel Sugarcurves, your selection for next year's All-County Read. I'm a lifelong resident of Washington State, and I live in the heart of the rural lands I write about. I'm a columnist, nature lover, photographer, and former teacher. Now about Sugarcurves. 10-year-old Aggie is high in a tree, sketching a crow's nest when her unpredictable mother forbids her to climb. The girl's angry, and she accidentally lights a terrible fire, then flees into untamed forest, wild with guilt and grief, where she hides among the trees and creatures she considers her only friends, determined that no one will find her. A search party gathers hours after Celia arrives at her grandmother's nearby farm. Hurting from her parents' breakup, she also plans to run. When she joins the hunt for Aggie, she meets two irresistible young men who compel her to stay. One is autistic, the other dangerous. This is a story about wilderness in the natural world of the Pacific Northwest, but also in characters' hearts as they hunt the mending power of forgiveness for themselves and for those who failed them. It's good stuff for discussion. I'm delighted that I'll meet your readers personally and see the landscape around Northwestern and Dordt, where many of my Linden students attended. Current Dordt student and artist Emma Vanderwood drew the wonderful frontispiece map of Sugarbirds, and I hope you get to meet her too. I'll see you next year.
All right, so thank you so much again for coming. Again, there are books for sale. We still have coffee, lemonade, water, and bars, so feel free to stay and mingle for a little bit if you like. Thanks again for coming.